just want to say I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, George. I just like the biggest congratulations to you for
Thank
this
you.
book. It is I yeah, I very firmly believe that a book launch should not just be the debut of your book, but like your victory lap. And so I have a request for everyone on the call, which is that because we can't be there in person with George, if you can give him as much digital love as possible, please do so. Please make sure that you tweet with the hashtag All Boys Aren't Blue so that we can see just how much love you're pouring to George. Um, and so I wanted to start with that. And then two, I wanted to start with George. I just want to say thank you. I don't know if I have ever in my life read a book where I have felt so precisely seen and represented, both just as a queer Black man myself, but then also I feel like there were an eerie number of similar experiences that we've had. Um, and it is a very moving and chilling thing to see yourself represented so in such an exacting way. So I just want to say thank you. But for anyone who's not read this book yet, since it's launching today, can you give us an elevator pitch of what this book is about?
Yes. So my book is called All Boys Aren't Blue. I guess I'll show the cover and everything. The book is a memoir, but it's a young adult Black queer memoir that discusses my age 5 to age 21. And it talks about my journey through understanding from a very, very young age that I was different. And I knew that I was different, but I didn't have the language to know what different meant. And so what you get is a journey through, number one, my eyes and all of the experiences I went through, the trauma, the bad things, but also the Black joy that I experienced throughout my life, because it wasn't all trauma. The second thing you get is a Black family experience that we don't often get to see depicted. We often talk about in media how we know slave narratives sell, right? People love to see that type of stuff. If I was, telling a story where my parents were abusive or like something like that, like we know that type of stuff sells. What we don't get to see is the narrative of a family that did everything they could with the resources that they had, with the tools that they had to give me the best experience that I could possibly have. And so the book, as much as it's a story about me, it is a story about this Black family of primarily Black women. My grandmother Nanny, my mom, um, my Aunt Munch, my Aunt Sarah, and my Aunt Crystal. Those are like the main five like Black superhero chicks that have always been in my life. And then their brother, my Uncle Rawl, and my dad, who are like the main pieces of how I connected to manhood in my life, and how like all of them infused so many different things within me, nurturing me as the person I was and not trying to force me into some box of what people thought I had to be. And so, yeah, that's what the book is. And the third thing the book is my mind. I give you insight into what I was thinking. And I think a lot of memoirs, they talk about experiences, but don't talk about what I was like, what was going on in your mind. And so that's the piece that people couldn't see, what I was processing. And that's my favorite part of the book, are the moments where I'm telling you what I was thinking and what I was daydreaming and those type of moments, because that's just as important as in any experience, because it was an experience that I was experiencing with myself.
So first, I just want to say, if you are George's family and you're on this call, thank you. I feel like through George's writing, I got to feel that love that you have for him radiating off the page, and George, the love that you have for your family. It was really beautiful to read. But to get started, I was wondering, so you have this idea for a novel. It touches, I was writing them down: trauma, joy, family, your mind.
Right.
Where do you start when you set out to put pen to paper? How do you take all of these big themes, these big universal themes, but also like deeply personal themes, and how do you start to write this book?
So for me, when I began writing the book, it was like I had a vision, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna write like all of these stories about what I experienced, and I'm gonna do it in chronological order and somehow it'll make sense, right? Like I'll go from 5 to 7 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 12. But as I started writing the book, I realized like some of my experiences overlapped, some things needed to be sectioned differently. And so it then became more important to write my stories through an essay rather than trying to write like a tale that follows very easily with my age, because some of the things that happened when I was young informed the ways that things happened when I was older. But to try and connect the dot from chapter 1 to chapter 10, or from chapter 1 in chapter 10, didn't make sense to me. It was like, well, no, connected. Like if this story was something that happened from when you were 5 to when you were 21, like talk about it in the same essay. And so that was kind of the route that it ended up going. Was it was best for me to tell the story and tell the stories. The stories is where the magic were. And so centering a lot of the overall themes within a story of something that happened is kind of how I decided to create the book. And so it became more about how this story relates to this ideology, how this story relates to this thing, and how these things played a role within this story that happened, instead of me trying to just write something in chronological order that you could just easily follow, because we are nuanced as Black queer people, and I needed the stories in the book to read the nuance in that way.
Mhm. So how did you then decide to start? Because you start off chapter 1 with the story about when you're a kid and you are attacked and you have your teeth kicked out. How
Mm.
did you know that you wanted to start there?
That memory is still very vivid. So like that's the one memory I've never forgotten. And it's the one memory I hold on to because I don't smile a lot. And so like people always say, like when they look at like my pictures and certain things, they're like, you rarely smile, you rarely smile. And I'm like, I know, like that's the one thing I'm still trying to get past. And it's like I know what it's attached to because I know what had happened. And so I was like, I have to start there because that is the biggest trigger for me, is the fact that I've never liked my teeth and I've never liked my smile, even though other people have always liked my smile. And so it was like one of those things, like, you know what, like start like at the thing that's the hardest for you as an adult to deal with. And you brush your teeth every day. You brush your teeth multiple times a day. So that's the one trauma that literally is always in my face every single day. When I brush my teeth, I think about it like, ugh, like I hate this, right? And so it was like, I have to start there. And I wanted to start with a story that was impactful, like so that people understood like where I came from as this boy who dealt with an attack that was really um, severe and didn't make sense, and just this kids, unfortunately, like kids being kids, but like it just turned very violent. Um, and I was like, I want to start there because I wanted to start there because I was like, I want people to get into this and think like, oh, we about to go through a tale of trauma, because you know that's what sell, right? And then once they start to get into the book, it's like, oh, wait a minute, like this didn't end his life, like this didn't ruin him, this didn't destroy him, like and George then became all of these different things from that and grew from that, and then learned how safety worked and learned how to protect himself, and had these cousins. I'm giggling because I'm just thinking Raul and Rasul, who just would fight anybody for me till this day, because they still at times are like ready to like squat up when they see comments and things about me, like when people come for me. And so it's like, yeah, I was like, I wanted to start there because I was like, you know, start where people think you're going to start, but by the time you get to the end, it's not going to end where you think it was going to end, right? And so that was the ultimate goal in choosing that as the starting point for where I wanted to tell my story.
And I especially loved how you wrote that start because of just that. It starts off as this story of trauma of this attack, and then you kind of get how you're thinking about it. There's a switch where it becomes like celebratory about like you and your family sticking up for you. But then also, I think that times where you kind of mentioned it, which is like there's a moment of uncertainty to it. And I think that's throughout the book too, where you say, this was a trauma I am learning from it. Other people liked my smile. I did not. And so you kind of grapple with all of these ideas, but they're condensed into this one story that goes somewhere different than you expect it to go from where it started. And it is such a complex thing to do in such a few pages, and you do it so well.
Thank you.
Uh, yeah, and you do it so well, but also in so many stories. How did you figure out from there what other stories to include throughout the book? You mentioned that the stories are where the magic are.
No, I knew that was coming, and it's funny because so I'll say this: I'm working on the next proposal, and like the stories that weren't in this are in that, and those are like the stories. And so I'm like, how did I choose like these stories, right? Choosing these stories, it was like I knew like it was important that this was about me centering myself and telling my truth. And so I actually had a conversation um, with my aunt Sarah when we were at my nephew's gender reveal. And I just remember she just walked up to me and was like, listen, like, I know you're gonna write about like some things that we just, don't know about or whatever, but she was like, this is your story. We'll, as a family, we will get through whatever it is that you gotta tell your truth about, but it's your story. So tell the story. And that was literally the one thing like that I needed in that moment to like be like, okay, like I'm gonna tell my story. And so the biggest thing for me was I knew what my target audience was, and so I knew what these stories needed to be for that target audience. We just don't have enough literature that speaks to Black children, and I'm not even specifically saying just Black queer children, but the fact that I had classmates who I'm still friends with, who I talk about in the book, who are heterosexual, right? So it's like as much as it was important that this centered us and centered Black queer people, it was also important that the friends who will read this understand that too, because when they have children, their children will sit in classrooms with a boy like me, or with a girl like me, or with a non-binary child like me. And it's important that the stories that I told in this book were something that they could take away, so that when they have those conversations with their kids, it's coming from a place of like understanding that we all are we are more alike than we are different, and that we're so conditioned to push back against our differences. And so I was like, I want to choose stories that showcase I existed with you all. I exist with you all. So, and I'm also right? I'm Black, I'm here, like I'm in community. So I need you all to understand what that community looks like. And I also wanted people to understand what it looked like when a family became my community, and when a family and friends and everybody understood what was going on and were like, okay, we gotta double down on love on this one, in a sense. And so, yeah, that's how I chose those stories, because I was like, there were some specific things that I needed the world to know in this book once it got out there.
I'm going to have many follow-up questions about what those stories are that you're saving for your next book. I totally want to tease it what the book is. But were there, in revisiting these stories, were there any that were particularly hard to write or particularly fun to write? Stories that you were like, this is so special to me. I'm having a blast kind of putting it down on the page.
Uh, of course, I think right. There were some stories that were extremely hard to write. The hardest story to write was talking about my grandmother Nanny's sickness, and her contract and having brain cancer, and like kind of like foreshadowing like where we were going in our journey. But that also, part of my favorite stories were talking about her too, like how she used to have me selling candy at the school, and like we would have our split, and like she was teaching me like how to have multiple streams of income as like a 7 or 8 year old, right? And so like those are some of my favorite parts. Definitely talking about the fraternity stuff, because now where I'm at in the fraternity is much different than where I was when we started. And like, I talked to several frat brothers today who were very excited about the book, and who were also like, I remember when we first started, and they were like, you were just too mouthy. Like you were so mouthy, and you just always had something to say, and it was like, I just wanted to like beat you up. And it was like, but like all these years later, like we're sitting here watching you like be like this activist and like this person, and like, you know, they're like, you change so many thoughts even within our organization around how we have to look at people and how we can easily just throw away people and dismiss people because of their gender or their sex. And it's like, if you take that step back and really start to appreciate people, then, you know, so many great things can happen for people like us, you know? So yeah, like, I guess that would be like, again, I think it's like my favorite parts of the book are Nanny. The hardest parts of the book were definitely Nanny, and definitely discussing my like my sex. That was tough because like it's like cringy, like for me to even read it or say. I'm like, ugh, I'm telling everybody my business. So that part was hard, but it was necessary because I was like, I want kids to not have the same issues I had and not make the same mistakes I did, you know, going forward. So yeah.
I loved reading the chapters about Nanny too, just because she sounds incredible. She sounds like I again could feel your love for her radiating off the page, and then it made me think about all the people in my life who have supported me and championed me. And you say in the book that Nanny had a saying that she loved all her children. She just loved them differently because she knew what they needed.
Yes.
And all of those chapters were wow. um, You write a lot about your family throughout this book, though. What were the conversations with them like as you were telling them, like, I'm going to be writing this book? Like, what happens from there?
The conversations were great and were interesting because, of course, it was like, well, I would say my dad, he was always like, well, what are you writing about? Like and he hasn't read it yet, I don't think, but he always like, well, I need to read this book at some point. I'm like, yes, you do. But he's always like, well, what are you telling? Like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, that was his whole thing. And like, he always has like this way of saying things like very like, I don't know. He just has this way of saying it. It's very Southern, but very like looking at you like, what you about to go talk about, right? But no, I did. I had several conversations with my family just about the fact that like I was going to talk about some things that I had never told them before. I was going to talk about some things that may be tough for them to read and tough for them to understand that I was processing, and some things that I was going through. But it made the book that much better that I talked to them first and didn't talk to them like after finding out those things. Because it helped me in the way that I wrote certain things, and it helped me in the way that I crafted certain stories, and the care that I took with certain characters and certain people in my life. That came because I had those conversations with my family just about some of the things I was going to talk about. So like, yeah, it was tough, you know, like early on, like to tell them like these things. And but I think it was worth it in the end. I think like, you know, I know a lot of them are watching and everything. So it's like, you know, now we get to celebrate how far we've come in the 2 years since we found out I was going to be writing a book. So yeah.
And one of the things that you do, especially with your family, but almost with every person that you meet in the book, is that whether there's a good time or a bad time, whether it's a joyful memory or a hard one, you show so much understanding and empathy and kindness to every person in the book. Is that, have you always been wired like that? Like,
Have I always been wired like that? I probably have not always been wired like that because they know, like, I like, cause we'll fight if we have to fight. I think that's another thing about my like, we'll fight if we have to fight. So it's like everybody don't just get that type of kindness and empathy until after I process, and then it's like, okay, I can figure out where you were coming from. I will say yes, like when I think about like a lot of the experiences in my life, when I think about some of the things that we've been through as a family with, like, let's say like certain family members who may have done something that we ain't like, or something that was like, you know, dead wrong or like disrespectful, like we always still found a way back to loving that family member.
mhm.
And so I think, I ain't gonna tell the stories, but I think there are just some great examples of some things that have happened in my family where I know other families would have cut that family member off. And it was like, we didn't cut that family member off, but we just put them on like you got restrictions. It's like you can still come to the cookout, but you can't eat everything. Like, you can eat some of the things or whatever. And so I think, and it's funny because I know if Aunt Sarah is watching, I know she knows what I'm talking about. But so yeah, like I actually grew up in a family where it was like you had people that did some things that were like really, really like, I can't believe you did this to me or whatever. But it was like we always found a way back to each other, and we always found a way like to have empathy for one another. And even now, like like this book is out, and we are in the midst of still grieving, the loss of Nanny, and so it's like it's just a lot of things have happened, since we first started writing it. And like there have been arguments and this and fallouts or whatever, but we all still found a way back to each other, like in her final moment. And so I will say yes, like I was raised to always have empathy. One of the things Nanny always said was charity starts at home. Like that was a big thing she always was about. She would go into her pantry, like if some other family members ain't have food, she would just pull from her pantry and send you home with a bag, right? And so, yeah, when you come from a person who just always is empathetic about another person's situation, even when they wronged them, like she could always still find a way back to loving you. And I think we all then took that, the best pieces of that, and we all operate from that same type of space.
We also saw, I saw in the chat, Aunt Sarah is here.
Yeah.
But this book is not just a memoir, it's a memoir manifesto.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So it was like, so my favorite quote is Toni Morrison's, if there's a book that you want to read and hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so, yeah, we know the word manifesto usually means a call to action. And so, of course, every chapter doesn't have a call to action. However, the book itself is a call to action. And so for me, it became a manifesto because once we started getting into the writing of it, and it's like, I'll just say, like in book world, it's like, there's a thing called comps. Like, well, what's this comparable to? Like, what's the, and when we really started getting into it, we couldn't find one. And so it was like, well, there are other memoirs, but why young adult, that's not a thing per se yet. And if it is a thing, it's definitely not a Black queer thing. So then it really did become like, okay, like this is a reckoning. Like this is a push forward. This is a push to push us in a space where the LGBT, well, the queer character in the book doesn't die at the end because I'm still here. This is a space to tell a story where everything in the queer character's life wasn't trauma. This is a space, like, so it was the manifesto part for me was this huge like call to action about, not only are we going to tell our story within the book, we're going to tell our story on the cover. We're going to tell our story on the back cover. We're going to tell the story isn't just, within the pages. It's everything about the title of the book tells you what it, like, I was very intentional about like, no, like I want people to know, like, this is what this is. This is a pushback against a lot of things that have been pushed on us. And like, I need y'all to understand how y'all are being conditioned, how we all are being conditioned to not love one another, to hate on each other, and to do these things to people who are different than us. And so that's how this then became like a manifesto. And I honestly feel like looking at some of the reception today and listening to how some of the people are receiving the book and talking about the book, I think is resonating in that way. Like people are really having to take a step back and look at their kids and be like, wait, I don't talk to my child about this. Or I've never asked my son if somebody ever, did something to him. I've never talked to my son, like, but my daughter, that's a different, and so it's like, you gotta look at it. It forces you to interrogate some of the ways that you operate around people. And so that's why for me, this is a manifesto.
And I love, there's my book, I like tabbed a lot of like the bottoms of my pages rather than the top. So I did book, and like my book's full of underlines. And there's a line, I think it's on the back of the finished version too, be bold and brave and queer.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on you say, love who you want to love and do it unapologetically, including that face you see every day in the mirror. Like while reading this, while diving into your stories, I felt so championed too, right? And I think that's such a special thing. That's why I started off with a thank you. Like all of these lines are just like so affirming in a way that I haven't before. Like, yeah, what do you compare this to? I haven't seen things like this before for somebody like me.
Mm.
Um, I'm about to throw it over to audience questions.
Okay.
So if you have questions, please make sure you drop them in the chat. But before I do, I just want to know, is there something that you is something that you want people to know, especially about this book? Like, if your book could whisper something from the bookshelf,
Could whisper something from the
what
bookshelf.
would it say?
um, I guess if the book could like whisper something, or if it was something that I wanted people to know about the book, um, this is what I'll say. If when you see the book and if you read the title and it automatically triggers something that you don't like, then this book is for you. I know who I wrote this book for, and I know instantly there are going to be a lot of people who gravitate to it, who feel seen and feel affirmed, and already know, like, wow, like this is my story. Like, finally, like this is that story. But I know there are going to be a lot of people who look at it and are disgusted and who are upset by it and who can't understand why this is out. It is for those people that the book is whispering to. This in essence, I know who the target audience is, but there's a second target audience that this book is for. And that is for the person that looks at this cover and cringes. That is for the person that uh, opens up the book and hears me talking about sexuality between men and just can't stomach it. Uh, that is also who this book is necessary for, because we all exist, we've all existed. And I'm going to be 100% honest, like, it is a privilege to wake up every day and feel perfect in the body that you were assigned. And we don't all wake up that way. I didn't wake up that way. And I talk about that in the book. Like, as a child, I couldn't figure it out. Like, I was like, I don't know what I am. And I'm too young to understand why I'm having these thoughts. And so that is what this book whispers to, the fact that, again, if you cringe, if you look at it, if you like, I don't know if this is for me, then it is for you. That's exactly who this is for.
Perfect. That was very well said. And also, no one cringes at this cover. This cover is beautiful. It's incredible. This art is stunning.
Yes. Yes. And the flowers are intentional. So like they're not just random flowers that we pick.
Oh, what flowers are they?
So the front flower is the bird of paradise. And that is my mom's favorite flower. And she actually has them in the front of our house. And they actually grow every year in the front of our house. The yellow roses, that's actually my fraternity flower. And so the yellow rose is the flower of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And I thought it was very important to include that on the front, because that's a big part of who I am and my journey through masculinity and trying to figure myself out. And the middle flower is the poinsettia, which is for my grandmother, because I just always remember around Christmas, she would always at the church be like, go grab the poinsettias, like we taking them home. Like she and would water them and keep them. Like that was like her every year, like that flower. And so like and that was the other thing, like every piece of the book tells a story. And so yeah, so even the flower crown was very intentional in what flowers were included.
I love that. There's a quote that I love. It was said by Catherine Schultz, who works at the New Yorker. And she said, part of what makes a story beautiful is the fact that you're dying to tell it. And I feel like in every facet of this book, even from the art, there are stories that you are dying to tell and that we are dying to receive. So thank you. I'm going to start off with audience questions now. Just a note to the audience, to everyone, thank you for being here. If your question is being read, feel free to turn your camera and your mic on. I feel like face-to-face time with George is great. And again, we're sad that we can't be there with you in person, so we're going to try our best to do it digitally. The first question is from Anya, and she asks, did you have any people in your life or outside influences who inspired you to start writing? That's a great question.
Yes. So my best friend Preston, I remember when I met him in Washington D.C. and I think one of his first stories that came out in Ebony. We were at this bar. We were at Number Nine Bar, and he was so excited about this story. And he showed it to me, and I was excited, and I was like, "Oh my god! Like I've always wanted to write." And literally, he looked at me and was like, "Well, write." And I promise you, we tell this story all the time because it literally changed the trajectory and I started writing. And that was like the biggest push. Like, and we had just met like a few weeks before that when that story came out for him. And literally that was like what started me to being like, okay, like, well, right, like what's stopping you from writing? And so I literally just started to write, and I started with my own blog, and I started posting more and tweeting more, and then it just kind of started to grow and snowball. um, but literally that was the thing that pushed me, was him literally just saying like, well, just write. Like I don't know what else to tell you, like go write. And that's literally what started.
Sometimes you just need like those friends, like it is, like straight, direct. It's like very simple, just write. Like, so thank you, Preston.
Like literally he just was like, well, just write. I was like, okay, and I started writing. So
I have some adjacent follow-up question, which is, you talked about like feeling seen in this book, and like, were there any books that you read growing up that you really identified with, that you really loved, that you felt seen or related to? Maybe not in like the very specific way, like this, but like any books that you gravitated toward growing up?
no, like I don't even know how. Like I don't even know how to be nice about that, because I get that question a lot. Like on panels, they're like, "Oh, well, what books would you recommend?" I'm like, "None. Like there aren't any. Like I don't know what to tell y'all. Like there are books like where we kind of like the side character, or like we like the cousin or the friend or the sassy friend. Like
Mm-hmm.
we ain't the center." And so, no, like I don't want to recommend any books yet. Like I kind of feel like, no, this is the space for us to create the books, right? And so I'm like, I ain't saying I'm the first, but I'm like, this is definitely me taking that step out there to be like, you know what, like I wrote this book, but the next book should be about maybe a kid that dealt with colorism. Then a queer kid that dealt with colorism, and then the next one should be a queer kid that dealt with anti-fatness. So like now we have to build the canon for this because we don't have one yet. And so like I don't have like a whole lot of books to recommend, like from childhood or growing up or anything, like besides like regular kid books that we all read. But um the book that I did read in college, The Four Agreements, was the one book that I always go back to, because they're just like, it's like a book of like different like lessons and teachings and like universal thoughts. But basically, every time you read it, it's different, because like if you're at a different stage of your life, then the things that you're reading about in The Four Agreements mean something different. And so that's a book that like you constantly have to go back to. So I always recommend The Four
So everyone on this call, you heard George. We're writing the canon. So
Agreements.
to quote Preston, right. So the second question is from Dion. Was there a new sense of the world around you after you completed this book? In what ways did this book help bring closure to some unfinished chapters in your life?
There a new sense of, yeah, I mean, like this book was cathartic. So like it was healing in itself. And um so yeah, like there was things that I just never talked about like publicly. There were stories in this book that I've never talked about, that I've never shared publicly. And so in sharing them publicly, I was healing myself in a lot of ways. And even with the first story about like the whole teeth being kicked in and all of that, I literally in January, I finally was like, you know what, I'm gonna go to the dentist. And like I went, and like I've had teeth pulled over the past couple of months. I've had like every single thing that I needed done, and I'm supposed to get braces next week. And so like I'm like finally now confident enough to heal that final thing that I've always wanted, which were good teeth and straight teeth. And so like, yes, this book is literally what pushed me to even like getting to that place of being like, all right, it's time. Like you're holding yourself back. Like nothing else is holding you back. So like push yourself to get there. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Next question is from Daryl. How did you come to the realization that your story was worthy and important? Did you have any doubts in yourself and the message you would have to offer to young Black queer people?
How did I come to the realization my story was important? Like, I don't know. I guess I always, like, my story always been important. Like, I don't know how else to say that. Like, I don't know if that's being like confident or cocky, but it's like, I didn't have to come to some realization. Like, I knew my story was important. I came to the realization though, because like when I would Google things and look for things, I couldn't find anything. And so because I kept like, for instance, when I was doing HIV work, I was looking for certain things around Black LGBTQ people. Couldn't find anything written. And I'm like, okay, but like we the whole population. Okay, so I need to write it. Every time I went and searched for something I couldn't find, I wrote it.
Mhm.
And so that's literally how I knew that my story needed to be written, because when I searched for it, I couldn't find it. And when I thought about like visibility representation, I was seeing more LGBTQ characters and representation starting to show up, but I still didn't feel like I was there. I still didn't feel seen. And so that's when I was like, okay, there has to be a swath of people like me that also still don't feel seen. So I now need to take that next step to make us feel seen. And so that's how I knew my story had to be told. And like I told it, and like, look, like MJ felt seen, right? Like, so that's already the one person, because like, you know, we all say like, if I could just reach one person, right? Like, I mean, that's the thing we all say, right? If I could just, if this book just reach one person. And so it's like, MJ already confirmed that it reached one person, but I know it's reaching a bunch of other people too. So that's how I knew. And I kind of talk about it in a quote about activism. I always say the first person I was an activist for was myself. And a lot of times when I would do something for myself, people would contact me and be like, I'm going through the same thing. And that's how I knew, okay, so my story is also your story. So I have to tell it. I have to write for it. I have to fight for it.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
I had a follow-up question kind of off that, which is there are moments of frustration too in this book about kind of just that, like there are no there's no canon, there's nothing there for you to like kind of land on, even as people are taking Black queer lingo. There's a point in the book where you say like how ironic it is that like some of the girls in this class are saying like your lingo, but they do it so unselfconsciously while you have that.
Right.
I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a chapter where I talk about a situation where I was, I think, in the second grade, and I had created this word called honey child. And it was my response to like, it was almost like my response. Like if a person said something, you'd be like, well, girl, or like, well, sis. Nowadays, I was saying honey child is like my response. And so some of the girls adopted that word. And so like before we knew it, like the class was all using that word. But I was the one who created it. And so, you know, the teacher called home about it, like, hey, like some of the parents are saying like, and the word was created because it's a weird story. Kids do things with words, I guess. And so like it was like me being a kid doing a thing with a word. But there was a girl in my class whose last name was Hawden's Child. And then there was my Aunt Crystal, who just came into my life, whose nickname was Honey. And so I like combined these two things to like create my own word, like that I was going to use. And when I first met my Aunt Crystal, I just remember thinking like she had like these long nails. Like, she just was like this cool like lady with like reddish brown hair. It was just a lot. And I was just like, wow, like who is this lady? Like dating my Uncle Raw. And so like I was just like processing a lot at 7 years old, and like I was combining and creating words. But what ended up happening was the school called home. My mom was like, you can't say that word anymore. And you know, it was just kind of like, I can't tell you why, because I know you may not have that language yet, but you just can't say it because the school has a, you know, an issue. And so, you know, I stopped saying it, but like nowadays, you know, we watch the Real Housewives of Atlanta, and we watch like all of these things, and we watch our lingo being used all the time, and shade and tea and reads, and it's like people get to like take the words that we create and the lingo we create and the culture we create, and they get to survive in it. And like when we do it though, like it's looked bad at, it's looked as demonized or whatever. And so that's the whole story around like that word and like how we got to that. But I feel like language is a powerful thing. And so like me telling that story was about like how we have to like, if we're gonna like, it's our language and we should be able to use it and not be demonized for it and not be penalized for it.
So our next question is from Jennifer, who asks, what was your favorite story to include? What part almost didn't make it into the book?
The chapter about Nanny almost didn't make it into the book. The one, A Lesson Before Dying, almost didn't make it into the book. And it almost didn't make it into the book because my editor felt it was a great chapter, but she was like, I don't know if this fits any theme. And so I was like, it's the most important chapter to me because this is it, like, and in that chapter, there's a story in the chapter, I talk about how she was in her room one day and she was changing her clothes and she called my cousin Little Raw to come into the room. And when he got to her room, he yelled, like screamed. And so like the other cousins come running down the hallway and like she was standing in like her bustier and like her like girdle, like with her stockings on, because she didn't care about who saw anything. And she like literally looked at him and was like, shut up, you may have to wipe my ass one day. And so that quote always stuck with me. Like for years, I always thought about that, like when she said it, because like she said it in jest, but I also, even that young, knew what it meant because I used to help her get dressed sometimes. I used to help her do things. And, then when she got ill, what ended up happening, she got ill with the cancer, and like literally I moved from Brooklyn back home with my parents, and me and my mom took care of her every day. And so in that, we had to literally become her main caregivers as she was, slowly deteriorating. And so that did become like, that was a part of the book that was going to be cut that I fought for. And I'm glad that we came to an agreement. Yes, Grace, I'm glad we came to an agreement to leave it in the book, because it really is a very powerful story about how the child becomes the parent at some point. And so yeah, that's the story. That's the one that almost got away, but we kept it.
I'm glad I was in there too. I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
Mm-hmm.
The second to last one is from Ryan, who asks, how have you navigated telling your truth in spaces like the fraternity?
Yeah. Only because I know Ryan. Ryan, of course he would ask that. How have I navigated? By yelling at y'all and cussing at y'all. No. I mean, sometimes, but no, I think, I think like the way for me to navigate it is like especially now, like we get to have very open and honest, transparent conversations, and like we talk about everything. And my biggest thing was like, I always opened up a space for the boys or the guys coming into the fraternity to ask me questions about stuff they didn't understand, because they also faced ridicule. And a lot of times the ridicule that they face when they're friends with me, it comes from like, I mean, I'll be honest, comes from girlfriends in their lives. Like, well, why y'all hanging out with that gay? Like, why y'all hanging out with him? Like, why y'all? And literally they start to question them. Like, well, I don't know, like what's going on over there? And that's something that I've experienced for years with heterosexual Black male friends of mine who have women in their life who sometimes don't understand how they can navigate that space. And so within the fraternity, one of the biggest things I wanted to do was show, like, I still do this work. Like, I still do this work. And I'm very, very proud of the work I've done within Alpha and within, in the lives of many of the people who I've helped to come through the organization. But I think it just took us a lot of time to grow and to learn and to understand that all men, like the Black male image isn't like one thing, and we all don't look the same. And even though we all don't look the same, we still should all be protecting the fact that the image shouldn't look the same and that it needs to look different for us to even grow and move as a society. And so I think that's always been the best way to navigate the conversations, is that I'm an open book and I allow myself to push myself to go to places when they ask, because sometimes some of them ask questions, like they ask like questions, and I'd be like, hey, I don't know if you want to know all that, but I'll tell you. But I allow them to, and I go there with them. And when they do something that I don't like or homophobic, I call them out and I let them know, and I try and teach them. We all know the biggest thing that we always teach them is like, female is not the word like that y'all supposed to be using when you're talking about a woman. Like, stop calling them females. That's always like the biggest one. You know, these females is like, that's always the biggest one. But it's been a growing thing for us. But yeah, it's turned out great.
Thank you, G.
Yeah.
And our last question comes from Cameron, who asks, do you have any suggestions / advice for young writers, for young queer people?
Yeah, the biggest suggestion, look, just like Preston said, you just gotta write. Like, you know, no, the biggest suggestion I would have is like, one, like to write, like, and don't get so concerned about like thinking that you have to have like the full structure of whatever it is that you're writing at the beginning. Grace is watching. Grace will tell you like how this book started is not how we finished. There were things cut out. There were sections that just didn't make sense. There were things that just didn't flow right. And then in revisions, there were so many things that were added. And so what I learned from that was like, anytime I go into writing another body of work or a book or some other large project that I'm working on, like to not get so stuck on the structure of what I think everything needs to look like, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those things are gonna move, they're gonna shift, and they're gonna swing around. The most important thing is that you're writing. Once you put the words on a page, you'll then realize like, you know what, like I wrote this in chapter 1, but I can take this whole section and move it to this part of the book or this part of the thing, and it sounds even better, or it works better here. Or, you know what, this is dumb. Like, why did I write this? Let me cut this all out. But the thing is, like, a book can't come out if you ain't writing. I say it all the time, like, you have to write it. And so the biggest advice that I always give, because I get hit up all the time by people like, how you do? I'm like, you have to just write at some point. You have to sit down, push past your fear, and just start to write it. Once you start to write it and get those words on the page, you can start to move them however you want, but you got to get the words on the page.
And then the second part of that question too was, do you have any advice for young queer people?
Yes. So the advice for young queer people would then be, you know, we are the blueprint generation. Like, we have always existed, but never had our stories talked about. And so it's like, we've learned about our people in the Harlem Renaissance. We've learned about our people throughout the history of time that we've always been here, but we always learn about them after they're gone, or we learn about them in pieces, right? And so I always say, like, when people talk about Martin and Malcolm, you should talk about Marsha, because like Marsha was also fighting the police, and Marsha also, what Marsha P. Johnson did got civil rights. It started all of this. You didn't get to marriage equality without her climbing on a lamppost and dropping a bag of bricks on a cop car, and without her, I mean, people could fight back and forth without her throwing the first brick at Stonewall. Like, it is what it is. Like, you know, like she also was a revolutionary who did that type of thing. And so for queer people, it's to understand that as a blueprint generation, the first generation that really is out there publicly, that has visibility, that has TV shows, that has these things, we're gonna make a lot of mistakes, but that also gives us a lot of space to make the mistakes. So don't be afraid to make the mistake. We're gonna make them, but you have to go through it. So, you know, think about your safety, of course, but outside of your safety, it is okay to be you, and it is okay to figure out what you is, and to really just lean into that and to go into that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that is phenomenal advice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to everybody, especially MJ for your thoughtful questions, and George for your wonderful answers, and the gift of your book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I put the link one last time in the chat to buy. I hope you all support Asa and George, and just thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you all for being here. I'm glad we were able to do this in the midst of a pandemic.
Have a good night, everybody.
All right, bye, everyone.
Congratulations again, George.
Thank you so much, MJ.
Thank you. Have a good night.